The wreath was still on the front door when I pulled up. I'd bought that wreath. Artificial pine, red ribbon, little gold bells that jingled when the door opened. I bought it 3 Christmases ago when my daughter and her husband moved into the house I helped them purchase. I remember standing in a checkout line at Home Goods thinking how nice it would look on their door, how I'd finally have somewhere to go for the holidays again. I sat in my truck for a moment before going in. 63 years old, sitting in a cold parking lot in front of my own daughter's house, the house that existed because I'd co-signed the mortgage and handed over $40,000 for the down payment, telling myself to breathe before ringing the doorbell. That should have told me something. My daughter's name is Vivienne. She goes by Viv. I've called her that since she was small enough to fall asleep on my chest. She's 34 now. Smart, funny when she wants to be, stubborn in ways that remind me of her mother. God rest her. Viva lost her mom when she was 19. Breast cancer, fast and brutal. After that, it was just the 2 of us for a long time, and I genuinely believed that made us close in a way that couldn't be broken. Then she married Curtis. Curtis Baird. She met him at a work conference in Atlanta 3 years before the wedding. She was in pharmaceutical sales. He was in something he described differently every time I asked. Business development, strategic partnerships, consulting. He had a firm handshake and a quality about him that I recognized immediately but couldn't name until much later. He looked at everything, including Viv, including me, like he was calculating what it was worth to him. But Viv loved him, so I kept my mouth shut and I walked her down the aisle and I danced with her at the reception and I told myself I was wrong about him. I wasn't wrong about him. The Christmas dinner was Viv's idea, or at least that's what she told me when she called in November. "Dad, come for Christmas Eve. I'm cooking." I said, of course. I asked if I should bring anything. She said, "Just yourself, Daddy." I remember she said Daddy. She hadn't called me that in years. I drove 4 hours from Asheville, North Carolina to their house in the Charlotte suburbs. Brought 2 bottles of good wine, a tin of Christmas cookies I'd made myself using her mother's recipe, and a gift bag with a cashmere sweater for Viv and a Yeti cooler for Curtis that I'd seen him mention once. $240 for a man who'd never once said thank you for the down payment on his house. The door opened before I could knock a second time. It was Curtis. He looked at me the way you look at a package that's been delivered to the wrong address. Not quite annoyed, just inconvenienced. "Oh," he said, "you're here. Not Merry Christmas, not come on in, it's freezing. Just, you're here." I smiled. "Merry Christmas, Curtis." He stepped back to let me in. The house smelled like something good. Roast beef, maybe, and garlic. The tree was up in the living room, multicolored lights, presents stacked underneath. A Frank Sinatra Christmas record was playing through their Sonos. It looked like a holiday card. It looked perfect. Viv came out of the kitchen in an apron, her hair pulled back, cheeks pink from the stove heat. She hugged me, and it was a real hug, the kind that lasts a second longer than polite. I held on to her. "Dad, I'm so glad you're here," she said. "Me too, sweetheart." There were others there already. Curtis's brother, whose name I always forgot, and his wife. A couple I didn't recognize, friends of Curtis's apparently, and a woman named Sandra, who turned out to be Curtis's former college roommate's girlfriend, which is the sort of connection that only matters to the person who invited her. Drinks were poured, the Sinatra record ended, and something louder came on. Curtis held court in the living room, telling a story about a golf trip to Scottsdale. I sat on the edge of the couch and listened and smiled and drank a glass of the wine I'd brought without anyone offering to open it first. Dinner was called around 7. The dining room table sat 8. There were exactly 8 chairs, 8 place settings with Viv's good china, the set we'd bought her together, her mother and I, as a wedding gift. Crystal glasses, cloth napkins folded into fans. I counted the chairs from the doorway. Curtis's brother and his wife, the couple, I didn't know. Sandra, Curtis, Viv, and the brother's teenage son, who I hadn't noticed until he came downstairs from wherever he'd been. 8 people. 8 chairs. I stood there doing the arithmetic and hoping I was wrong. "Viv," I said, "where should I sit?" She was carrying a dish from the kitchen. She looked at the table. Something moved across her face, there and gone, like a shadow. "There's another chair in the office," she said. "We can pull it in." Curtis was already seated at the head of the table. He didn't look up from his phone. "We don't really have room," he said. "The table only fits 8 comfortably." The room went quiet enough that I could hear the candles. "He can take my spot," said Viv. "You're hosting," Curtis said. I watched my daughter's face. I watched her do the same thing I'd been doing for 3 years, the calculation, the pivot, the accommodation. I watched her decide it wasn't worth the fight. "There's a tray table in the closet," she said to me, very quietly, "and I can set you up in the kitchen. It's actually cozy in." "I'm fine," I said. I was not fine. I went to the kitchen and I stood there for a moment with my hand flat on the cold countertop, looking at the window above the sink. There was a motion sensor light out there that Viv had asked me to install the previous spring, which I'd driven down from Asheville specifically to do. I could see the little white housing of it out in the dark. I took my coat from the hook by the back door. I picked up my keys from the counter where I'd set them when I came in. I walked back through the dining room, and 8 people were passing dishes around and talking, and only Viv looked up. Her expression broke something open in my chest that I haven't been able to fully close since. "Dad, Merry Christmas, sweetheart." I kissed the top of her head. "The cookies are on the counter. Your mother's recipe. Don't forget to refrigerate the ones with the buttercream." I walked out of my own daughter's Christmas dinner, drove to a Hampton Inn 11 minutes away, and sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial detergent and stared at a television I didn't turn on. My phone had a text from Viv at 9:14 p.m. "I'm so sorry, Dad. He just gets like this sometimes." I read it 3 times, then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the light. I didn't sleep for a long time. Here is what I had not told Viv or Curtis or anyone. The house they were sitting in, the house with the china and the crystal and the Sinatra record and the Christmas tree, that house existed in its current form because of a document I had signed 4 years ago and a check I had written, and a decision I had made to put my own retirement at partial risk because my daughter was happy and I wanted her to stay that way. Here's something else I had not told anyone. 3 months before that Christmas dinner, I had driven past their house on the way back from visiting an old college friend in Concord, and I had seen a moving truck in the driveway. I didn't think much of it. People buy furniture. People move things around. But the truck had a storage facility logo on the side, and the men loading it were carrying out pieces I recognized. A leather armchair I'd seen in their living room. A console table. What looked like the antique credenza Viv had inherited from her grandmother. Loading them out. Not in. I slowed down. I didn't stop. I told myself there was an explanation. There was an explanation. It just wasn't a good one. The morning after Christmas, I drove home to Asheville. I made coffee in my own kitchen, and I sat at my own table, and I did something I should have done a long time ago. I called my attorney. His name is Dennis Holt. He's been my lawyer for 20 years, handled my business when I sold it, handled my wife's estate, handled various smaller matters over the years. I trust him the way you trust a doctor who's delivered bad news to you more than once, and had the decency to do it straight. I told him about the house. I told him about the mortgage I had co-signed. I told him that I had reason to believe some of our jointly documented assets might be in a situation I didn't fully understand. Dennis listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I pay him for. Then I told him about the moving truck. He was quiet for a moment, "Do you have a copy of the original purchase agreement?" he asked. I did. I have copies of everything. My wife taught me that. Paper trails, Wendell, she used to say. Paper trails in labeled folders. Dennis asked me to send him the documents. I did it that afternoon. 2 days later, he called me back. What he told me took about 20 minutes to explain and about a week to fully absorb. The credenza, the armchair, the console table, and a number of other items I hadn't seen. Furniture, a set of collectible watches that had been a wedding gift from Viv's late uncle, 2 pieces of art that had belonged to Viv's mother and that I had specifically transferred to Viv as part of her mother's estate. Curtis had been selling things. Quietly, methodically, through a combination of estate consignment shops and online marketplaces over the course of at least 18 months. Some of it was unambiguously his to sell. Some of it was not. The watches, valued at somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000, had been a gift specifically to Viv and were documented as such in her mother's estate transfer. The 2 paintings, one a small original oil, one a signed lithograph, were similarly documented. There was more. Dennis had a contact at a firm that did asset searches, and with my authorization and some careful cross-referencing, they found what appeared to be a pattern. Curtis had 2 credit accounts that Viv did not appear to know about. There were cash advances, there were transfers to an account that traced back to something registered in Curtis's name alone, which Viv was not on, which had been opened 8 months into their marriage. Curtis Baird, who had married my daughter, who had let me co-sign a mortgage and contribute $40,000 to his down payment, who had seated me in the kitchen of a house I helped buy while he sat at the head of the table. Curtis had been quietly draining resources and moving assets for the better part of 2 years. I sat with that information for 4 days before I did anything. On the 5th day, I drove back to Charlotte. I didn't call ahead. I timed it for a Thursday afternoon when I knew Curtis worked from home because Viv had mentioned it months earlier, and I have a good memory for details that might matter someday. I rang the doorbell. The little gold bells jingled. Curtis answered in sweatpants and a company quarter-zip, coffee mug in hand, looking like a man who'd had a comfortable morning. His expression when he saw me was not comfortable. "Wendell," he said, using my first name. He always used my first name. "Curtis," I said, "I'd like to come in." He stepped back. I walked into the living room and sat down on the couch without being invited to. He stayed standing. "I've been talking to my attorney," I said. I watched the color shift in his face. Not dramatic, just a slight draining, a rearrangement. "About what?" "About the co-signed mortgage, about the terms I agreed to when I contributed to this property, and about some questions that have come up regarding certain items that have left this house." He sat down then, put the coffee mug on the table with a small, careful click. "I don't know what you think, you." "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to tell you what's going to happen next." I took a folded letter from my jacket pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. "That's from my attorney. It outlines my legal position as a co-signatory on this property. It also details our intention to pursue a formal accounting of certain estate items that were transferred to Vivienne as part of her mother's estate and appear to have been disposed of without her documented consent." He looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. "You need to leave," he said. His voice was different now. Quieter. "I will," I said, "after you've had a chance to read that. Dennis's number is at the bottom. He's expecting your attorney's call by the end of next week." I stood up. I looked around the living room, at the blank space on the wall where one of the paintings used to hang, at the corner where the credenza had been, at the furniture that remained, and the spaces where furniture wasn't anymore. "I want you to know something," I said to Curtis. "I have never wished you ill. Not when Viv brought you home, not when I signed that mortgage, not even on Christmas Eve when I ate alone in a hotel room. I wanted you to be who she thought you were. I genuinely did." He didn't say anything. but I'm her father, and that job doesn't come with a retirement date. I let myself out. The gold bells jingled behind me. What happened over the next 3 months is the part I have to be careful telling, because some of it is still legally sensitive, and some of it belongs to Viv more than it belongs to me. But I'll tell you what I can. Viv did not know. That much I want to say clearly, because some people hearing this story will assume she did, and she didn't. When Dennis's firm laid out the full picture for her, with documentation, with account records, with a detailed accounting of what had been sold and where the money had gone, she sat in Dennis's conference room and she didn't speak for a long time. I was there. I watched my daughter's face when she understood what her husband had been doing. It looked like the floor had dropped out from under her. Curtis had, over approximately 26 months, liquidated or diverted somewhere in the neighborhood of $68,000 in combined assets and cash. Some of it was technically his, money he'd earned, joint funds from a joint account, but a significant portion included the estate items and 3 cash advances against a credit line that was tied to the house, meaning the house I had co-signed. He had not discussed any of this with Viv. He had spent a portion of it on what turned out to be a business venture in Greenville, South Carolina, that had already quietly failed. The rest was harder to trace. He didn't fight the civil claims very hard. Dennis said later that Curtis's attorney had probably advised him that fighting would only expose more. He agreed to a repayment structure, the value of the estate items, plus the unauthorized credit advances, paid back over time with a lien recorded against his future assets. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice in the big cinematic sense, but it was documented, and it was binding, and Curtis Baird would be paying it back for years. Viv filed for divorce in March. She called me the night she made the decision. I was in my kitchen, eating reheated soup, watching the news with the volume too low to actually hear. My phone rang, and it was her, and she said, "Daddy, I'm done." And I put my suit down, and I said, "Okay, sweetheart, what do you need?" She moved into an apartment in Charlotte, small place, 2nd floor, nice natural light, close to a park. I helped her move, carried boxes up the stairs, assembled furniture from IKEA that came with instructions written in a language that appeared to be a dialect of confusion. We ordered pizza and ate it on the floor because the table wasn't built yet. At some point during the second pizza, she looked at me and said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." Okay. I knew Christmas Eve was wrong. I knew it when it was happening. I kept thinking if I kept the peace, if I didn't make it a big thing, it would get better. She picked at the edge of the pizza box. It never got better. I know, I said. I should have stood up for you. I looked at her for a moment. My daughter, who was 19 when her mother died, who had held herself together with remarkable toughness ever since, who had made one very significant mistake in a man's character and was now living with the enormous cost of that mistake. "You're standing up now," I said. She cried a little. I handed her a paper towel because we hadn't found the actual napkins yet. She laughed at that, which was the right response. There are things I've thought about in the months since. Mostly late at night, the way you do. I've thought about whether I should have said something sooner. About Curtis. About the moving truck. About the Christmas dinner. About 100 small moments I noticed and filed away without acting on. I don't have a clean answer to that. I wanted to be wrong, and I wanted to let Viv find her own way, because she's an adult, and because the alternative, being the overbearing father who poisons his daughter's marriage with suspicion, was something I was genuinely afraid of becoming. I've thought about whether letting her live rent-free in her apartment. I quietly covered her first 3 months while she found her footing, was the right call. Some people might say that was too easy, that she should have had to manage on her own. But she didn't mismanage our money. Curtis did, and she'd already lost enough. I've thought about Curtis, not with anger, mostly more with a kind of tired bafflement. He had everything. A patient wife who loved him, a father-in-law who wanted to like him, who would have helped him if he'd asked, a house, a life that was genuinely being handed to him in part. And whatever hunger was eating at him was so relentless that it consumed all of it anyway. Some people are like that. Some hole in them just can't be filled. The house eventually went through the divorce proceedings. Given the outstanding lien and the credit complications, it was sold. I was made whole on the co-signed portion. That was the term Dennis used, made whole, which struck me as an interesting phrase for paperwork to use. Paper doesn't make you whole. Time does that, slowly, imperfectly, in the way that scars are whole, but not exactly like the original skin. Last Thanksgiving, Viv drove up to Asheville. We made the turkey together, which we hadn't done since she was in high school. She remembered that her mother always put apple slices in the cavity, which I had forgotten, and she was right. So we did that. We ate at my kitchen table with the radio on and the back door cracked because the oven had overheated the room. After dinner, she helped me do the dishes, and we talked about her new job. She changed companies, better territory, better management. She talked about a man she'd been on a few dates with, carefully, the way you talk about something fragile. When she was leaving, she hugged me in the doorway for a long moment. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said. I held on to her. "Viv," I said, "that was never a possibility." She drove away in the early evening dark, taillights going small and then gone around the bend in my road. I stood in the open doorway a minute in the cold, the way you do when someone leaves who you're glad came. Then I went inside, washed up the last of the dishes, and sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the quiet. It tasted like something I'd been waiting a long time to get back. I keep coming back to that wreath. The little artificial pine one with the gold bells that I bought and hung on a door that technically had my name on the mortgage paperwork. There's something almost funny about that, in the way that painful things sometimes are funny when enough time has passed. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not just understood intellectually, but felt in the way you feel something after it cost you, is that life has a kind of accounting system that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send a warning. It just keeps a ledger quietly, and one day the numbers come due. Curtis wasn't a villain in a movie. He was something more ordinary and more sad than that. A man who looked at generosity and saw weakness. Every time I helped, the down payment, the cosign, the motion sensor light I drove 4 hours to install, he recalibrated, decided I was someone who could be used rather than someone worth respecting. That's a failure of character, and character has consequences. Not because the universe is watching and keeping score in some mystical sense, but because the way you treat people shapes the world you actually live in. Curtis built a world where he took without asking and assumed no one would notice or push back. That world collapsed on him. He built it that way himself. What I wish I had understood sooner, and what I hope anyone watching this takes with them, is that being good to people is not the same as being a pushover. I was good to Curtis because I wanted my daughter to be happy and because I believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Those are not bad instincts, but I let them override my judgment for too long. There's a difference between being patient and being willfully blind, and I blurred that line for 3 years because looking clearly at the situation felt like a betrayal of Viv. It wasn't. Seeing clearly is the most loving thing you can do for someone, including yourself. When I finally did look, when I called Dennis and said something is wrong here, I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of the same care that had always been there. The difference was that I finally paired it with clear eyes and the willingness to follow what I saw to its conclusion, even when it was hard. That combination, caring deeply and thinking clearly and being willing to act on what you know, is the only thing that actually helps anyone in the long run. They'll also the better now. Not perfect. You don't walk away from 5 years of that without carrying some of it with you. But she's figuring out who she is when no one is quietly managing her. That's its own kind of starting over, and it takes real courage. The kind that doesn't make noise. The kind that just shows up in small decisions every day. And me. I'm 63 years old. I drive 4 hours for people I love, and I always will. I just don't sit in hotel rooms quietly anymore when something's wrong. That's the part that changed. Not the love. The silence around it.